I remember the whole thing like it had just happened, and, you know, the professor stopped everything, and the only thing I can think to myself, like almost immediately, was, God, I hope they're not Arabs, and I hope they're not Muslim.
I was 11. And that day when my mother came to pick us up from school, my mother observes the hijab. And when she picked us up in my father's old station wagon, I'll never forget it, there was a car that cut us off right when she picked us up and, you know, flicked her off and said, go back to your country.
And my professor had gotten a phone call from the Dean of Education. And then she hung up the phone and she put her palms on her desk and she just went silent. And she lifted up her head and she said, our country is under attack.
We had to stop mourning at that moment and start reacting what would come next.
And my visceral reaction was I started mourning for my son who's only a week old. Because I knew at that moment that things were going to get bad and that he would never know how it would feel to live as a Muslim in America prior to this day.
I think my kids were telling me, should we leave? Should we leave this country, Baba? Is it why they are hating us? Is something going on? Because at that time, most of the news was only about incidents taking place against Muslims.
And then in the days after, walking home from school with a few of the kids, because we didn't live too far away, there was a gentleman that pointed a gun outside of his second floor window who said, keep walking before I decide to shoot you Muslim kids. That was like the immediate after.
Surely death is an eager seeker. Death is a talib that doesn't give up. Death is determined. Well, there's been positives in regards to the effects that had on the Muslim community. The Muslim community, especially many people who come from immigrant backgrounds, were forced to be more civically and politically engaged and to step outside of their cultural cocoons.
No, it's a gift. I can't turn a gift down. May Allah bless you. May Allah protect you and protect your family.
Since 9/11, especially with this many decades after, I can very much trace stages of the formation of my Muslim identity post 9/11. And I know for a fact that it would not have been the same if something like that tragedy hadn't happened.
November 3rd, 2001 was the first day of Ramadan, and that's when I put my scarf on. So I said, you know, I just said, you know what? At that point, I really felt like self-identity had to take place. Like, who am I? Obviously, I knew I was Muslim. I grew up as a Muslim, but no one knew that. And I wanted to prove to the world that Muslims are not like that. In every religion, there are extremists and people that, you know, don't do what they're supposed to.
And knowing, too, that people are entitled to have their own opinions of who we are, right? And it's not going to ever, it will not ever define who we are. You know, if people form an opinion of who I am, then that's just simply their opinion of who I am. If it isn't an accurate representation of me, I'm not going to let it define who I am.
But because we're a minority community, because we're a community that has been ostracized and unfortunately looked at as the other, we continue to keep having these conversations. These people do not represent my faith. They don't represent me. They don't represent my community. And why should I have to continue apologizing for someone else's actions when we don't see other people apologizing for the rest of the nation's actions towards groups of people?
To me, it's ludicrous framing. It's like, it'd be like Christians trying to go out and say, oh, the Ku Klux Klan really doesn't represent Christianity. Or that Hitler mentioned something about Christianity in Mein Kampf. They say, oh, well, Hitler doesn't really represent Christianity, or David Duke.
But I think at some point I realized that if we as Muslim Americans aren't willing to tackle this head on, we can't just wait back and assume that we're going to allow somebody else to control our narrative. We have to assume and control it for ourselves.
I just remember calling my parents and telling them I was going to run for state representative, and my dad's the one who said, no one's going to vote for an Arab after 9/11. I just remember, like, I was so sad at that moment, not because I didn't believe in what he was saying, because I was like, no, Dad, that's not. But at the same time, he was thinking that, and that made me think, is anybody else thinking that?
We've built enough bridges and allies to where it lessens the burden. Where if there's an issue that impacts the Muslim American community, the Arab American community, people aren't waiting for the Muslim or Arab American to speak out. They have the knowledge, they have the relationships to also stand up and speak out, because ultimately many of these issues are humanitarian issues.
Dearborn was in the spotlight. Dearborn was like the epicenter, so to speak, according to some news outlets, as the hub of terrorism and the place to watch for anti-American activities. So it was a horrible assumption. And then the magic solution was, it was right there in front of us all the time. It was Dearborn Public Schools and the public schools in general throughout our nation, because you have peoples from all walks of life attending these schools. So you had Arabic kids, Muslim kids, Jewish kids, Christian kids, from all walks of life getting to know one another.
I think this barrier that we're breaking down, largely thanks to social media, where people are proud of who they are. And we're building bridges not only within the Muslim American community, but across with the Black community, with the Hispanic Latino community. I think that gives me hope more than any. And I'm hopeful that we trend in this direction. You know, hope is obviously greater than fear. I think we all know that. We still have a lot of work ahead of us as a society, as America.